Hey there, everybody. Steve coming to you from my home, which periodically some of these videos will happen at home, even though most of them I'm enjoying doing while I'm out walking about town. But anyway, hello, everybody. How you doing? It is March 14th, 2021. A new day, a new video. But before we get there, remember, as always, to like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon, all those little things to help my little channel grow. The link to my Patreon is in the description, as well as the links to my Instagram and Facebook pages closely related to the content that I'm producing here. All that said, let's go to a very, very interesting story, a story that was posted in a Portland newspaper on the date of March 14th, 1915. But really, it's a story that spanned almost a decade. Enter Robert H. Dunkirk, a name that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to anybody, aside from people who maybe know his story or descendants of people that maybe had direct experience with him. But this was a guy that for 8 years leading up to 1915, this guy was essentially a forger on the run. He was constantly bouncing. I think he started out of Omaha, Nebraska, and he just bounced around and bounced around. And by his own account, he, when he first took a shot at doing this, he was down on his luck. He was broke. He was in need of some money quick, and he decided to commit the act of forgery. And he discovered in his workings, like most people that are successful in crime and get away with it for a long time, he was very charming. He apparently had a great vocabulary. He was a strong conversationalist, and he knew how to win people over. And he said himself, he discovered people were really gullible if you put them into the right mindset. So this guy was able to con person after person after person, and he managed to stay on the lam for nearly a decade. You think a lot of people, even back in his time, obviously back in 1915, it was a lot easier to get away with various forms of crime just because of the time and the place. But still, even in that vein, most people did not get away with things for this long. And Dunkirk was a stealthy guy. He didn't just go into random, mom and pop places and pass bad checks. He didn't, he wasn't like the old West gunslingers. He didn't just go to random small towns in the middle of nowhere and rob their bank of the, $2,000 that were in it. He would, I'm sure there was a little bit of that, but he would take some pretty daring actions. He actually, one of the people that he got into the good graces of and kind of conned along with a lot of other people is a guy named, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his last name right, but a guy named Carl Laemmle, who was a head at Universal Pictures, way back in the day. I know my girlfriend has some posters up in our bedroom of old films. I noticed 2 of them are Carl Laemmle productions, and I didn't really know anything about the guy. And apparently this Robert Dunkirk got in well with him. So he actually developed some Hollywood connections along the way. He also managed to con some people into thinking he was a member of the fairly iconic Duke family, the tobacco family. Duke University in North Carolina is named after them. He managed to pull a con where he convinced people he was a member of that family. So this guy was very good at what he did. But, being great at something comes at a price. And over time, you're a man on the run, years start going by, and Dunkirk started getting a little worn down by his life and constantly having to bounce from one place to another. And it's interesting, he started, again, this guy had a strong vocabulary. Aside from his criminal side, this guy was seemed to be a pretty charming, pretty appealing, forward guy. And he started actually keeping a diary, which is interesting when you think of a criminal way back in the early 1900s, the rough and tumble American, he mostly lived, the western half of the United States. So, still some frontiersland out there back then. And here's this guy keeping a diary, which, was, I don't really know how common that was back then. And one of the reasons he started doing it was a way to kind of deal with the fact that he was just worn out and emotionally spent. And one of his entries shortly before, we get to around the midpoint of March 1915, again, March 14th was when the particular article that I saw was posted or printed. And he wrote in his diary words to the effect of, I have little doubt that I will be apprehended very soon. And I don't know if he felt like the brass was closing in on him and it was like he was being backed into a corner, or if he just, it was almost like something that he just knew deep inside, like, I can't keep going on like this. I'm at my wit's end. So, maybe there was a small part of him that almost kind of wanted to be caught. Well, obviously there was a part of him that wanted to be caught, but when you get to that point mentally, you might intentionally or at least subconsciously do something wrong that will lead to your apprehension. Shortly after this entry, Dunkirk was apprehended in a hotel in Portland. Finally captured after 8 years of being on the run and becoming a fairly notorious forger. Again, a lot of people who dabbled in the concept of forgery and passing bad checks, these people weren't really successful being on the lam for very long, and this guy almost managed to make a decade of it. And upon his apprehension, Dunkirk, who's right up there with these he should be right up there with these iconic people that always managed to skirt the law, and even if they were apprehended, they managed to get away somehow. People like John Dillinger, things like that. And this guy's really not that well known. I'd never heard of him until I stumbled onto this article, but this guy really should be up there with some of the most notorious, criminals of all time, at least in terms of being able to be on the run, as long as this guy was successfully able to do. And when he was captured, you'd think, oh, God, it's a run that lasts that long, and then you're apprehended, and it's like, oh, it's all gone now. Well, Robert Dunkirk was only relieved to finally be apprehended. He probably gave the cops a hug as they were cuffing him. Not that that's actually possible. But yeah, he said, when he was spoken to the following day after he was arrested and spent the night in jail, he said it was the best sleep he'd had in months and that he was so relieved and happy that it was all over. And this is as he's being prepped to be sent back to Omaha, where, a lot of his criminal activity began, wherein he was probably going to face, obviously charges and some sort of trial and probably a fairly long stint in prison. And yet he sat there in his jail cell looking at that fairly bleak future for himself, and all he could do was just sit back, relax, and feel nothing but just calm and bliss that it was finally all over, and he didn't have to be running from town to town and looking over his shoulder constantly and having to pull yet another scam after another scam just to stay one step ahead of the law. And actually, according to the end of the article, the reason he was specifically going back to Omaha, even though he'd had probably other, various, forms of forgery going on there, but it was in direct relation to pretty much the scam he pulled on Universal Studio, or the Universal Film Company, I think is what they were called at that time, or something along those lines. So there's that Carl Laemmle connection again coming into play. But yeah, it was very interesting. Dunkirk he didn't hide why he did it and how he felt about it. He said he always regretted it, but sometimes the need to continue the scheme overrides that. And he said, it was, he was, broke when it started, or when he started doing this. And, for him, it was easier than, having to make money going out and getting a job. And, how many times have we heard, criminals use that as their logic is, hey, I could get, a 40-hour-a-week job that's going to break me and probably pay me a lot less than I can make doing this, so I choose to do this. And maybe it was fun and exciting at first, and then over the time, as the years pass, it starts to weigh on you, that sense of, never having a sense of freedom, never being able to just walk down the street and not wonder if someone's going to notice you, or wonder if a cop is going to recognize you. You're going to turn the corner and just face to face with a police officer, and then it's over. Even though that ended up being his saving grace, at least, emotionally. And one of the primary reasons he was so successful in what he did was, in a lot of his forgeries, he took out small amounts of money. You'd think if somebody's going to commit forgery, they're going to try to get a lot of money, as much money as they can. They're going to forge for, thousands of dollars at least. And so it seems that Dunkirk was doing forgeries for very small amounts that didn't get a lot of attention, and wouldn't really strike up any suspicion. Why, let's say he forged a check for like $3. Who's going to see someone put in a check for $3 and immediately be like, no, this is suspicious? So that seemed to be part of his gig, and that was one of the main things that allowed him to be so successful, and for this kind of ongoing enterprise, if you want to call it that. He was able to continue it for so long. But in the end, he was just happy to be able to lay down in a prison bed and just let it all flow away from him. Even though his future probably was, again, going to be pretty bleak from there on out, at least for the next several years. So it's what happened on that particular day, March 14th, 1915, is not the complete encompassing of that whole story, but it was the end of an 8-year reign of forgery by this guy. So I saw that and I thought, okay, this isn't a crazy story, that just some weird thing that happened that day. But it was still something very interesting. You stumble onto this article and you're like, what's this? They print the guy's picture in the local newspaper, and he's got just the most classic 1915 criminal look. He's got just the very straight face, the very kind of eyes glaring right through you. He's got the little black hat on his head, and just could not have looked more like a criminal from that period of time. He literally stereotyped himself into that role, it would seem. But again, he was apparently a very charming and affable and intelligent guy. And so in the end, I saw that story pop up and I was like, this is definitely something interesting and fun. And it's this guy who probably, after his apprehension in 1953, where'd that come from? 1915, he was probably a guy that just went off, did his time, and was, forgotten, maybe gradually, maybe quickly. And so, you talk to even probably historians, they have no clue who this guy is. He was just a guy that was a big deal for a while, and then he popped up in a Portland newspaper on March 14th, 1915 as this iconic forgerer, and then he's just gone. That's one of those are some of the stories that I love to cover, are ones that just, they're here and then they're gone, and nobody knows about them. And you almost can't know about them unless you're rummaging through a whole bunch of old newspapers and something just catches your eye. Sometimes you just have to be lucky. And pretty much all these stories are luck. I just click on a random newspaper and I find an interesting story and I'm like, boom, that's my story for the day. And Robert H. Dunkirk's apprehension and the legacy he left behind is our story for today. So I hope you enjoyed that little telling. Again, I thought it was just interesting that there's so much history leading up to that one day. So I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, remember to like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon, all these little things to help my new little channel grow. The link to my Patreon is in the description below. I'm always posting new things there, so you'll get some bang for your buck if you become a patron there. And also, it's connected to my Steve the Amateur Historian channel, my other main channel, and there is a link to my Facebook and Instagram pages that are closely related to the content that I'm posting here, as well as my Steve the Amateur Historian YouTube page, and the Patreon just goes towards helping all of them. It's essentially a history-centric Patreon page. So if you want to help me out there, thank you in advance. I love you guys. Thank you so much again, one more time, for watching. And until next time, this is Steve. I'll catch you later.